We've given you a nice big lunch, and now we've dimmed the lights, so we're going to start out by having an extensive discussion of botanical nomenclature. You laugh. Okay. So my talk today is going to be about defining variety, varietal, cultivar, and clone. Since there's some misconception about that, I want to be sure that we get it all right. You're paying a lot of money to be here, and we want you to walk away scientifically enhanced. So we're going to talk about ways to select vines for your vineyard. You're going to learn some really surprising information. We're going to talk about the importance of clones. Okay, shut the phones off, please. And we're going to talk about interesting plant material for now and the future. All right, I have a black belt in botany, 3rd degree, and there was a time where I could recite all the mosses and liverwort genera of Northern California, and thank God I'm past that phase. But I still kind of bow to the International Code of Nomenclature for cultivated plants on cultivar. It turns out we kind of use the term variety incorrectly, botanically speaking, but we're kind of on a roll here. The term cultivar most commonly refers to an assemblage of plants selected for desirable characters that are maintained during propagation. So most cultivars arose in cultivation, but there are a few selected special ones from the wild. The term variety actually is a part of botanical nomenclature, and we use it kind of incorrectly. An older synonym for cultivar or hybrid, which is now discouraged by the International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants, a very august group, but we still use it with regard to grapes and rice. So strictly speaking, variety is not the right term. It's supposed to be cultivar, but the train's kind of left the station, so we use them interchangeably, and probably most people know wine grapes as varieties, but if we actually cultivated it, strictly speaking, it's supposed to be a cultivar. Varieties are supposed to be naturally occurring. It's a taxon of naturally occurring plants. It's a little bit different from the species, and it's usually geographically related, but we don't have time to go into all that, so let's move along. And then a varietal wine is a wine made primarily from a single named grape variety, and which typically displays the name of that variety on the wine label. So examples of a grape variety commonly used in varietal wines would be Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, or Merlot. So to remember, the term varietal is an adjective, not a noun. So by the end of today, I expect you to have this all straight in your head. Okay, so we're not going to say varietal anymore when we're talking about a particular grape cultivar. We're going to say variety, but we know we're being naughty, and we're supposed to be saying cultivar. So anyway, that's just an aside, but again, you're paying a lot of money to be scientifically correct when you walk out of this course, so we're going to give you your money's worth. Next, we go to clone. So a clone, by definition, is a wine grape vines that are genetically identical, and they're propagated from a single mother plant, which is usually a single stem. So all clones that are in our collection at Davis started out as a single stem. And the origin is from the early 20th century from the Greek word clone, which means twig. So that's why the connection. All right, so now we're going to talk about the whole issue of choosing wine grape cultivars. There's different approaches that you can take. By far, the strongest one is market. Market is very, very important because it's kind of defined about what the wine industry is going to be, and it's a really interesting story, which you're going to hear today. It's going to be a history lesson. Heat summation is also another very, very good way to evaluate a site, and you're going to hear much, much more from Mark when he talks on that, but we are going to discuss it because it is a good system for deciding where you're going to plant things. Site evaluation is also critically important, which Mark is going to get into, and I'll just mention briefly in passing. Experimental data. We don't do enough of this. Most of us aren't patient enough. Most areas are planted before we really figure out what's right for this area, because if you do a really good job of experimental data on cultivars, and clones, it takes 20 to 30 years, and most people aren't patient enough to wait. They want to go now. So that's why usually we have to go through 2 to 3 vineyards and 2 to 3 generations before we figure out what's really right for a location when it's a new wine growing area. Intuition. intuition is something that some people really have. They kind of know, hey, this is right for the site, and we'll talk more about that towards the end. Here are some real peculiarities about the wine growing world compared to other horticultural crops. The plant genetics of many of our cultivars are very, very, very old. Market decisions in some cases were made 400 to 800 years ago that are still very much in play today. It's very difficult to make inroads with new plant material in wines. You may love something, but nobody else does. It's really kind of a problem. It's called market myopia, where you're really focused on a variety that you think is just superb, and other people won't even drink it. Finally, presently, plant breeding programs for new wine grape cultivars are very limited in their success in terms of acceptance. So we've had breeding programs trying to come up with new cultivars, and they've been, by and large, not so super duper successful. You know, when you look at other horticultural crops like nectarines, an old nectarine tree never gets to die. It gets grafted over at least 3 or 4 times first because they have new cultivars coming out. See, even I do it. They have new cultivars that come out every 5 to 10 years, and the market goes, wow, look, it's more red than the last one. Let's go ahead and change it. And red in fruit is a really magical color. So every time we start out with something like a Granny Smith, before long there's red Granny Smiths because the apple industry loves red color. And, you know, there's things like that that change the market conditions. It's not the case with wine grapes. All right, so let's talk about this market. So the bottom line is you have to sell what you grow. Unless you're really small scale, like 25 vines. But if you have anything bigger than that, you're probably going to end up with more than you can drink in a year. So you're going to have to sell some fruit or wine. So the upside is that if you get a contract for your vineyard, you really strengthen your business plan, and it's an important part of risk management to know where there's a home for your fruit. The risk is that trends come and go. So let's suppose you plant Merlot, Pinot Gris, Sangiovese, or Syrah. The winery wants it for maybe 5 years. They'll give you a 5 or 10 year contract, and then after that they don't want it anymore. So then what do you do? So this is part of the risk because things come and go in some cases. And the downside is that the plant material may not be really suited for the vineyard that it's planted in. So we tend to drive things by wine grape cultivars. I'll also say varieties. So because that's a common term for them. So that's kind of how we make a lot of our choices. It's made in the marketplace. It's not made so much about what's really right for this site. When you get out of the United States, there's a term that they use a lot, and some of you might have heard of this, the international varieties. How many of you have heard that term before? It's very, very common when you're discussing vineyards in other parts of the world because they grow other kinds of things, particularly if you're in Europe and they have their own local cultivars. We use the term international varieties, and they've been kind of earth-shaking probably in the last 50 to 60 years in the wine grape industry. These varieties are Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. They are very, very important in world trade. They're very, very important in California. And why is that? Well, they have the long modern history of export production. I mean, really long. And they are perceived as quality. And they defined very early on that what made quality, and they were probably among the first ones in the modern world to really pursue appellations and other ways of distinguishing themselves in the marketplace. And there's also a good hint of tradition in it as well. So we can't talk about this unless we discuss the British. The British Isles and wine. So in 1152, this is when Napa Valley's fate was decided. Eleanor of Aquitaine marries Henry Plantagenet, and French wine can be shipped duty-free to England. Okay, so there's a real economic incentive to export wine to England. The English need alcohol. If you've ever been to England, it's a really cold, misty, wet climate. The food used to be really terrible. You had to maintain a stiff upper lip. And you had to have some way of being able to medicate yourself, and alcohol was the drug of choice. So by the 1650s, we're seeing Chateau Haut-Brion wine from Bordeaux. It's imported to England as a luxury item. And let me tell you where Aquitaine was. You need to know that. Aquitaine was Bordeaux in the Loire Valley. So we're going back a long time when this commerce started in that part of the world. There was also significant imports of champagne, cognac, sherry, port, and wines from the Loire and Burgundy. And the reason that Bordeaux became such an important place was because they had a port right next to the ocean. So you could come on with a boat and fill it up and then go off to England with your wine and sell it. And it's very, very interesting. As I was reading about the history of this, kind of reminding myself how it all happened, there were sort of legal trade routes, and there was also what they called privateers, or pirates, that would come in and kind of help you move your wine around, sort of like, sub rosa, so people didn't know what was happening. And you would pay them money, and they would bring the wine from your winery to the customer. So it was the beginning of the, I guess it was the model for the wine distributor. So anybody who deals with wine distributors suspects there might be piracy involved. But there actually is a case in point. If you go back in history, you can see that's exactly what was going on. Let's consider European viticulture compared to where we are today. The climate is really much more continental. There's more rain, the overall cooler in many areas compared to California. And if you look at where they're grown, they are grown from the 38th to the 50th parallel. And a vintage happens when the grapes actually become fully ripe. So they declare a vintage year when they actually hit 23 sugar. Because a lot of times the 21st of September is your picking date. The gig is up. It's starting to rain. The leaves are falling off the plant because you're pretty far north. So they're not going to ripen very much anymore, so you might as well pick. And that's kind of how vintages are decided. In the 1960s, it was really an aha moment for Napa Valley and California in general. And that's when Robert Mondavi started Mondavi Winery based on the fine French wine model. Here's Robert over here. Okay. He was actually working off of a little bit of André Telesheff, who was probably started in the late 1930s with Brialou Vineyards and Georges Letour. And he was classically trained in France in what's the right term? Enology. And he was really probably the first winemaker in California to make really high quality wine in the French style. And then I think the real aha moment was when we had the judgment in Paris where the French picked Napa Valley wines as being superior to their own. And probably one of the worst PR moments that the French wine industry has ever had. And they vowed never to do it again. And the Chardonnay maker was Michael Gergich for Chateau Montelena, and then Warren Winiarski for Stag's Leap for Cabernet. And that really got the ball rolling here in California for embracing the idea of the international varieties and the fine wine industry. So if we look today, I don't know if you can see all this, but you can see our top 5 and top red and white varieties. The top reds are Cab, Pinot Noir, Zinfandel, that's an outlying point, Merlot, and Syrah. Those, by acreage, those are the ones that are most planted. And then for white, Chardonnay, French Colombard, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, Muscat of Alexandria. So that just shows you that there's been a huge effect by these events, and the international marketplace for wine has strongly influenced how we choose the cultivars for a vineyard. Now, if you want to do this a little bit more scientifically, heat summation is a really good system. And the traditional way of doing it was with thermographs, and now we have electronic devices. But this was started by Dr. Winkler in probably the 1940s and 50s. So it's a really good way of figuring out our macroclimate, which is the large climate around an area. And degree summation is a very good way to start evaluating them. In California, this depends pretty much from the distance from Pacific Ocean, fog incidence, wind. And then as we start moving to mesoclimates, this would be the weather around the vineyard and the property that you're on, where slope aspect, elevation, and other factors will affect your mesoclimate. And finally, the vineyard design, vine training would affect microclimates, which Larry kind of alluded to in his talk. There's multiple heat summation systems in California. We like the Winkler Index system because it was taught at UC Davis, and there's a lot of UC Davis grads in the wine industry, so we're really comfortable with that. We know the system well, but there's others that might be more accurate, but that's the one that we use mostly. So this is a really good place to start for a macroclimate kind of evaluations. How it's determined is we look at the sum of mean daily temperatures. We subtract the minimum from the maximum, divide it by 2, and then subtract 50 degrees. And it sounds real complicated, but we have it all worked out. So there's 5 regions. Region 1, which is 1700 to 2200 degree days. Region 2, which is 2200 minus, or 2800. Region 3 is about 2800 to 3500. We're getting warmer as we go through these regions. Region 4 is 3500 to 4000, and then region 5 is 4000 plus. So what we're finding today is we can just use data loggers and add up the hours above 50 degrees, and they correlate pretty nicely. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough. That's what a lot of people do to kind of figure out where are we with our phenology of the vines, and are they going to fit. So region 1 would be the cooler areas. So this is ideally suited for Gewürztraminer, Riesling, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. Will do well if this is your heat summation and you have, all things considered, enough time to ripen the fruit. Elevation, slope aspect, and soils are very, very important as you get down towards the edge. What we're looking for to have a really successful vineyard is that warm spot in the cool region, and that's basically how these cultivars were selected originally. If you look at Northern Europe, they tend to have cultivars that come out early. They tend to be lower in acidity if you expose them to heat, and they do well in kind of a shorter growing season. So in my county, the deep end of Anderson Valley, which is the end that's closest to the ocean, it's only about 14 miles, is a very cool region because they're getting a lot of cool wind and fog coming in from the Pacific. Region 2 would be that 2200 to 2800, and here we see Pinot Noir and Chardonnay looking good on the low end, if you're around 2200. And the high summation, you'll find that Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Cab Sauvignon, Zin, and Syrah, although these can be kind of tricky if we have a cool, wet year. But 2800 is usually enough to get Cabernet ripened, and Cabernet takes a fair amount of heat to really do well. So again, elevation, slope aspects, and soil extremely important. And in our region, Boonville and Yorkville Highlands would be kind of examples of that area. We get into region 3, now we're hitting kind of the sweet spot of where we have a lot of viticultural area in California, particularly in the coastal valleys. And here we find that it's a great region for Zin, Petit Syrah, Syrah, Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. So we can do red wine grapes very, very nicely here. In the deep soils, Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc are grown here, along with Viognier, Roussanne, Marsanne. So those are other important cultivars that you can do in this kind of location. In our area, Big Valley of Lake County, Ukiah, Hopland, and Red Hills would be examples of this. Region 4 is getting warmer yet. So this is the warmer interior of California. We find large crops of international varieties, which are very important to the California wine industry. So those vineyards are usually designed to yield a lot. They don't have quite as good quality maybe as Region 3, but they're still in the ballpark. And if you actually grow some of the Mediterranean cultivars, they can be really interesting, like Touriga Nacional, Ionico, and Nero davola, which I'll discuss a little bit later. Region 5, it's table grapes. It's probably not really the best place to grow wine grapes. Raisins, these are the deep interior valleys. Wine grapes are grown here as well, but they often need fixing at the winery. So you need a big bag of tartaric acid and some ultra purple, and you can make something that's drinkable. But it's not really wine, it's a wine-like substance. Okay, wait, there's more, and that's the Mediterranean region, and this is where I've spent a lot of my career looking. And I've actually gone there a lot, too, which I know it's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. We have a Mediterranean climate. We're part of that 1% of the land mass of the world that has a Mediterranean climate, which is really interesting. So it's characterized by wet winters and dry, warm summers. It's only 1% of the planet's surface, but we have 16% of the biodiversity of the planet. It's an amazing area. You know, I love living in California. It's just such an interesting place for so many different levels, but plant material is really one of them. If we look south of where the international varieties are grown, you'll discover there's a whole lot of grapes. So Greece has about 330,000 acres, a little bit more than Australia. Italy has over 2 million acres. Spain has over 3 million acres. And even Portugal has about 647,000. And while they grow international varieties there, that's not the dominant cultivars that are grown in those places. There are some sort of commonalities when we start looking at these cultivars, and generally they're productive because they have a tradition of volume drinking. So if you wanted to stay alive 2,000 years ago and you were Julius Caesar's army, you were drinking from the same water hole that the horses were, okay? So you had to find some way to deal with water quality, and a good way of doing it was by drinking wine. So Julius Caesar had a ration of 2 liters of wine approximately per soldier. And not only were they healthy troops, they were happy troops. So when he said, let's go invade England where the people are blue, they said, okay, sounds good to me. And, it was part of being healthy before we really understood water quality. And in fact, all the old Italian friends that I have talked about how they started drinking diluted wine as young children. And one of my wine-growing friends in Mendocino, Charlie Barra, talked about his grandpa who drank a gallon of wine a day. And his grandmother used to say, Luigi, that wine is going to kill you. And he said, sure enough, when he was 96, he died. So, it shows you that it's an important part of Mediterranean culture is to be a wine drinker. We'll find that in general they have pretty good acidity and heat. They're vigorous and take heat well. So they're used to sunshine, they're used to warmth, and it doesn't mess them up the way that Pinot Noir grown in Bakersfield would. So where have these cultivars been? What's the story here? The locals drank them in large volumes, so there wasn't a lot to export to begin with. And then the fine wine models have kind of recently arrived in the past decades because they were mostly locally consumed and nobody was really selling them. And the reason for that is wine was blocked from importation and commerce in Great Britain until the past century. So the British votes believed in the legal monopoly. And even though we think that the Boston Tea Party was about taxation without representation, what it really was a fight against corporate monopolistic greed, because essentially the British East Indies Company had the exclusive right to sell tea in Boston, and they were really sticking it to the consumers. And it was as much about that as it was about taxes that got everybody riled up. So until recently, you couldn't sell a lot of these wines into England and into their commerce. So it took a while for the fine wine model to kind of drift there. We now see that cultivars are imported into California in the 1800s, and they really were the basis of our wine industry at first. And if you look at 1960, what were the top 3 cultivars grown in Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino? Mendocino was Carignan. Sonoma County, their number 1 was Zinfandel, and in Napa Valley, it was Petit Syrah. They're all Mediterranean-origined cultivars. Here's another term that you use, and again, because we're going to leave you as being really deeply steeped in science, is autochthonous. Autochthonous means that it's native to a particular region, and you hear this term a lot when you're in Europe and they're talking about their varieties that are adapted to their local region. They use the term autochthonous, and it means basically that it's indigenous or descended from migrants or colonists, or it's local. Okay, so in the autochthonous cultivars of Europe, in many cases, have been there forever. So if we go to southern Italy, we'll find cultivars that were brought there by the Greeks 2,500 years ago that are still making really good wine. This goes back to my point about how we really have very conservative genetics in the wine grape industry. I'm going to share with you just a few standout cultivars that I like. Asurtico is from the island of Santorini in Greece. How many of you have ever been to Santorini? Oh man, put it on your bucket list. It is really an extraordinary place in many, many ways. So what's amazing about this grape is that it has great acidity and very warm climates. They also grow it in a really unusual way. They train them into baskets. So they weave the canes into a basket, and they hug close to the ground, and at night condensation forms on the leaves, and they're self-irrigating. So they don't have any other way of watering them because they're in fairly coarse volcanic soils. And they're on their own roots, and vines can be 400 or 500 years old, and they just renew them periodically. They'll cut them off at the ground level and start a new cane and weave a new basket. So nonetheless, it still is an amazing cultivar when we bring it out and grow it into warm places. We could be in region 4 and have pretty decent acidity with this particular cultivar, and it would be a much better idea than growing Pinot Gris. So another one of my favorites is Nero davola from Sicily. How many have ever had Nero davola before? Really, really wonderful, deep color, great fruit, vigorous, productive. Again, thinking about a warm place, this would be a cultivar that I would definitely select. Ionico is one of the ones I was telling you about that's 2,500 years old. It was selected or brought to southern Italy by the Greeks when southern Italy was a colony known as Onotia, and that means the land of wine. And we find that it's late, it's not particularly vigorous, it doesn't have large clusters, but it has superb color and flavor, and it's very, very long-lived. I also wanted to show you the unusual trellising system. So here's one for you, Larry. Maybe you've seen this before. These are called Tendons, and they were originally, this is on the Amalfi Coast in Campania. And they grow grapevines here, and they have vegetables. They also have citrus and olive trees kind of intermixed. And they refer to that as promiscuous culture. And of course, promiscuous sounds Italian, right? But what they're really talking about is a mixed culture, and it's very, very old. This is probably how they grew grapes back at the time of Julius Caesar, because space is really limited, and this is a really sweet place to go. It's a really magnificent Mediterranean town or area, and very steep, great volcanic soils. Everything's on their own roots. There's no phylloxera there because these volcanic soils, phylloxera just doesn't exist. Touriga Nacional is from Portugal. It's a very late grape. It has small clusters, deep, deep color, amazing color. Good acidity, good flavors, and it's grown in the Douro region of Portugal, which is famous for these terraces that are cut out of the mountainsides. It's used to make port, but it could also make a table wine. Grows well in California. It's late. It ripens very late, and it's one of my personal favorites. From Spain, there's a grape known as Graciano. It's very productive, great color and flavor. It's very vigorous. It's usually blended with Tempranillo, Garnacha, and Mazuelo. Mazuelo we know is Carignan. And it's mostly found in the Rioja region of Spain, kind of south of Bordeaux and north of Barcelona and Catalan. I mention these because one of the things I want everyone to realize is that if present trends continue, the vineyards that we plant today are not going to be in the climate of 30 years from now. It's going to be warmer. And if you leave this meeting with anything in your head about vineyards, is that you really have to design your vineyards to be resilient. You have to find ways to think about drought, heat, limited water for irrigation, and plant materials can be part of the mix. I think the first thing we can work with to give us some flexibility is going to be with rootstocks, which you're going to hear from Andy Walker. And then cultivars. Even if we're going to go with a Cabernet vineyard in Napa Valley, I was recently on a panel talking about climate change. You better plan on having 75% Cabernet Sauvignon along with a little bit of Petit Verdot and maybe Carmenere or something else that can take some heat, because it's very, we're forecasted to rise almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit in about a 30-year period. So having things that are heat tolerant is going to be an important part of what we do with the wine industry in California. Now we're going to switch gears again and go to clones. So in many respects, clones are fine-tuning. A well-designed and managed vineyard has a much larger impact on wine quality than a clone does. So if you don't have things that are, if you don't follow all of the lessons that Larry gave you in the previous lecture, clones are really kind of insignificant compared to actually setting your vineyard up right and having it in the right site, and everything else that makes a vineyard good. It can be an assurance of plant health, maybe, because you've had some remarkable screw-ups with viruses that have passed through our certification system. And it's not always the fault of the people running the system, because there's some things that just fly under the radar, and I think red blotch is a good example of that, which you'll hear more about as we go on through the course. You know, at the vineyard's marginal for some cultivars, clones can make a difference, either increasing yield or increasing the potential for ripeness, improving flavors, or resisting bunch rot and mildew. So we've got some options. It's not to say that clones aren't important, but they're not the be-all, end-all to make a vineyard work. They really are fine-tuning. You have to have a pretty good vineyard model in place, and this will just help you get it a little better. The principles behind clonal selection initially was to improve plant health and yield. So if we go back to the 1950s and 60s, when this process started, we had a lot of things like viruses that were really suppressing yield and ripening. And the first goal of most of the clonal selectors back then is, let's get something that can actually make fruit and make fruit without having that can actually ripen properly. So that was sort of the first goal. So if we look in California, the pioneers such as Harold Ommel, Curtis Alley, William Hewitt, and Austin Goheen began collecting and preserving these clones. The UC Foundation Plant Services created as a repository for healthy materials once we found them and were sure they were clean. And then we learned other techniques like heat treatment and such to test for viruses to get them into good condition. There is also similar activity in Europe in places like Ontov and Rochedo and Coniano. Now we find the second round of clonal selection has been for quality. So that probably started in the 80s and 90s, where we went back and took a look at, okay, now that we've got clean clones, how about we get something that's a little special in terms of what it can add to the blend in the wine. Here's an example from work that I did of Sauvignon Blanc, and it shows it very, very nicely. So you have very big clusters here, and then we have smaller clusters here, and you see a range. So if I'm a grower in Lake County getting paid $1,000 a ton for fruit, I want to get about 10 tons per acre to pay the bills, so I want this clone. On the other hand, if I'm in Oregon at one of their overpriced wineries, hope there's nobody from Oregon here. I probably want a clone like this because it's quite a bit cooler, and I want to look for a clone that's more open and smaller, and it takes less photosynthetic horsepower to ripen it. So, we see clonal selection happening all over. And then every once in a while, since we made wine and tasted through some of these. Question?
Just a quick question. Where are these clones coming from? Are they from research farms or from growers' vineyards? Where are they?
They came out of my trial that I did with Fetzer Vineyards on Sauvignon Blanc, because one of the frustrations that Deborah Golino has, who's the head of Foundation Plant Services, it's an amazing repository of clones, but we actually have very little data on how a lot of them perform. And since Sauvignon Blanc is sort of the national variety of Lake County, or the national cultivar, we really wanted to know, what are we missing? Is there something we should be growing in our mix? Because we certainly, with cultivars like Pinot Noir, we can really see some amazing things if we evaluate the clones and get more diversity. So that's why this was done. All the selections here were taken from UC Foundation Plant Services. The little flags underneath them tell you where they came from, but they're all clones that are at UC Foundation Plant Services. There are some clones that don't yield and taste bad, and that's this one here, which is clone 14 from France. And I don't know why you would plant that, because it certainly was a loser in our trial. So it just shows you, just because it's a clone doesn't mean it's necessarily great. There is no best clone. Some are selected for yield and fit a value-priced wine program, like Clone 4 Chardonnay. But Clone 4 Chardonnay also makes good wine, too, if it's managed properly. Others have significantly lower yields but taste better and are right for more expensive offerings. So if we have, again, Pinot Noir is a good example of that. There's some clones that yield low and get really nice and ripe and have all kinds of special qualities. But they may not necessarily fit into a vineyard where you would have to get some yield to make it make sense. A clone selected in another country is not automatically superior to local clones. The conditions where clones are selected make a difference. So you have to understand why they were selected. The Dijon clones of Chardonnay make sense in Burgundy and Oregon, where they taste, where it's cold and it's hard to ripen stuff, but they taste kind of washed out in Ukiah, which is a solid region 3, and 60% of the yield compared to clone 4. So planting Dijon clone Chardonnay in my neighborhood doesn't make any sense. We can make much better wine and get a lot better yield out of clone 4, which is our industry standard. It's really helpful if someone has tested clones in your region, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of support for that financially. You almost have to find a farm advisor given to lost causes like myself, and a good cooperator like Fetzer Vineyards. So I was raised an Irish Catholic, and we believe in patron saints. And I was reading about who are the patron saints of lost causes, and I found this one named Saint Rita, who I think is pretty much who I should follow. And she had just a dreadful life. She married this guy she didn't really love, and it was a forced marriage, and he was really mean to her. But she did have 2 really nice sons, and then her awful husband died, and she thought, okay, life is looking good. And then her 2 boys were killed. And then she said, well, I think I'll go to the convent. And the convent said, no, we don't really want you. You're kind of old. We don't really want you to be a nun. We'd rather have somebody young. So she just persisted and persisted, and they said, okay, we're going to give you a task. Here's a dead grapevine, make that thing grow. So she put it in the ground, she was watering it and take care of it, and it sprouted to life and made fruit, and I decided, wow, this is a viticulture patron saint for lost causes, so that's St. Rita, rock on. Here's another term that you hear used in Europe that we don't hear so much here in California. It's called massal selection. How many of you have ever heard of this before? Yeah, so massal selection was a French growing term for the practice of replanting a new vineyard from an old, where they liked a particular vineyard that had really exceptional qualities. And they would go and propagate from there. And that was what they called the old way of propagating vineyards that's been replaced with clonal nursery stock. Now, there was some advantages to that because you did get a lot of diversity in it. The big problem today is that we're accidentally moving viruses or other diseases into new plantings. Multiclonal plantings can really add complexity. So Burgundy is new clones, but they're not going to sell them individually to any particular wine grower. You get them as a group. They say, here's your clones, here's your vineyard, and they mix them up. Many fine wine producers think that a mix of clones makes the most complex wines, and they usually plant them in separate blocks. They don't mix them together because they still like things to ripen together if you can. But in Anderson Valley, which I think is the best Pinot region in California, since it's in my neighborhood, the backbone of most of our wines is the Pommard Clone 4, and then we also use a little dab of Wadensville FPS 2A because it was always grown in Anderson Valley. We like Dijon clones 115, 667, 828, and maybe even the Champagne clone FPS 32 because it adds a little bit more fruit and juiciness to the blend. So that's what I like about that as somebody who's also studied ecology is that we find when we have a broad base of genetics, it builds some resilience into your system. You probably have also heard the term heritage clones. Have everybody heard that before? So this term is actually co-opted from Mendocino County rose growers. And the story behind this was when Jim Wolpert and some of us other farm advisors started looking for old Zinfandel clones, I just threw out the term, well, they should be our heritage clones. And Jim said, hey, that's really nice. I like that term. And I said, well, I didn't invent it. It was these 2 older women in Mendocino County that went around to old homesteads and found roses and propagated and identified them. And they created the heritage nursery, and I thought that was a really good name for this process. So essentially what we find with the heritage clones, they tend to be pre-phylloxera disaster material in Europe. So we have some very, very old clones that were brought to California before phylloxera wiped everything out. And we have some quality selections of Syrah, Sauvignon Blanc, Zin, Cab Sauvignon, Chardonnay, and others that are pre-phylloxera heritage clones from California. They potentially are very high quality. I did want to leave you with one last thought about intuition. It really helps if you're clairvoyant, if you're going to be using intuition. And some people just seem to know. And Andrei Teleshev is, I have the best story about this. When I was in Italy and visited Ornellaia, which is one of the super Tuscan estates, Andrei Teleshev traveled there when they were planting it, and they wanted to do basically a Bordeaux mix. And he went there, and they were going to plant Cabernet on this one hill, and the story goes that Andre lay down on it with his arms and looked up at the sky and said, "No, this is for Merlot. You don't want to plant Cabernet. It's going to be Merlot." And they said, "No, we don't want Merlot. We want Cabernet." So they planted Cabernet, and it didn't work out, so they yanked the vineyard out 20 years later and planted it to Merlot. And it makes probably one of the best $7.99 Merlots you've ever going to taste. Now, that's $799. That's what they get per bottle. And it's considered to be one of the flagship Merlots of the world, probably only surpassed by places like Chateau Petrus and some of the other French producers. But it just goes to show you that Andre really knew his stuff, and he was amazing and had a lot of intuition about wine growing, which unfortunately the rest of us probably don't. Nonetheless, intuition is still a way that people select sites, and I don't discount it. I think that people who work long enough in the industry see some subtleties in vineyards, and they eventually can put together a very good idea of where things belong. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for coming. There's some nice pictures of Syrah, and there's some nice pictures of Pinot Noir that I've taken because I did those. Those are the only ones that I know. We probably need more pictures like that where you can take a look at them and get a sense, because that's our first take when we can take a look at the size of a cluster. Gives us some information about going to marginal sites where it's cool. But no, we don't really have good pictures like that. That's something that probably should be done by Foundation Plant Services. Unfortunately, all their vines are in Davis, so we don't really know what it would be like in a more normal wine growing region where they don't have 40 feet of topsoil. Yes?
I don't recall, but is there a relationship between Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Sauvignon?
Yes. They're probably siblings or parents. We think that might be one of the parents. Sauvignon Blanc is the parent of Cab Franc. Okay. Yes?
So with clones planted next to each other in different plots, is there ever any cross-pollination or genetic influence from one on the other, or is new clones basically just genetic drift?
Clones are basically probably either occurring naturally or some sort of subtlety we don't quite understand yet in genomics, because when we do genetic evaluations of these things, they all look identical, and yet we know that they're not. So we don't really quite understand what gives the clone effect. Some cultivars are way more prone to it than others. So if we look at Pinot Noir, it's very unstable, so we find things that drift back and forth between white and pink. We also find that they'll revert back. On the other hand, if we look at Zinfandel in California, it's remarkably uniform. We don't really have a lot of clonal variation. And it's probably because I think Zinfandel came as one selection from Massachusetts as a greenhouse grape for fruit originally. So it probably has a very narrow genetic base. However, if we go into southern Italy, where there's a lot more area under cultivation, you would probably find more variation in the clones. And in fact, Primitivo, which we import into California as a separate cultivar, is actually the same genetically as Zinfandel, but it grows very differently. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Question?
Are there any medicinal varieties that you can smell that have a distinct aroma to them? For example, maybe black muscat or something? Or all the different varieties don't have a distinct.
There's aromatics in a whole bunch of different varieties as well as clones. So we have some aromatic clones. For instance, in Chardonnay, we have a clone that has kind of a muscat aroma. And so we see those genes kind of drifting around. But yeah, for sure, there's some very aromatic varieties, or cultivars, sorry, such as, well, most of them have high terpenes, like Aleotico, Viognier, things from the Alsace. So I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much.